The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of southern Pennsylvania as Private Thomas O'Malley of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment carefully folded his latest letter home. His weathered hands, stained with gunpowder and dirt, trembled slightly as he sealed the envelope addressed to his beloved Mary in Portland. He had no way of knowing that this correspondence would become one of the most poignant testimonies of what historians would later call the turning point of the American Civil War. According to research documented in the Gettysburg National Military Park Archives, over 3,000 personal letters and diary entries from the battle have been preserved, offering unprecedented insight into the soldiers' experiences. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain rode along the dusty road toward the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, his mind heavy with the weight of command. The former professor of rhetoric and modern languages from Bowdoin College had traded his classroom for the battlefield, and now led the 20th Maine in what promised to be a decisive confrontation with Confederate forces. In his personal journal, he would later write, "The very air seems charged with electricity of impending battle. Our boys march with determination, though I see in their eyes the same uncertainty that gnaws at my own soul." Lieutenant William Thompson of the 1st Minnesota Infantry had been writing religiously to his sister Elizabeth since enlisting 2 years prior. On this particular evening, as his regiment made camp near Gettysburg, he penned what would become one of the most detailed accounts of the pre-battle atmosphere. "The countryside here is beautiful, with wheat fields stretching as far as the eye can see. It seems almost sacrilegious that such pastoral beauty should soon be transformed into a theater of war. The local farmers eye us with mixtures of curiosity and fear, their children peering from behind their mothers' skirts." Meanwhile, Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee were converging on the small crossroads town from multiple directions. Sergeant James Robertson of the 3rd Corps under Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill wrote to his father in Virginia, "General Lee moves with his characteristic confidence, though I sense an urgency in his commands that speaks to the desperation of our cause. We are far from home, deep in enemy territory, seeking that one decisive victory that might turn the tide of this terrible war." The townspeople of Gettysburg found themselves caught in the middle of history's inexorable march. Sarah Broadhead, a local resident, documented in her diary, "Soldiers have been passing through town for days now, some in blue, some in gray. The tension is palpable. We board up our windows and pray that whatever is coming will pass quickly. The children are frightened by the constant sound of marching feet and the sight of so many armed men." Captain Michael Brady of the Iron Brigade felt the weight of 3 years of warfare bearing down on his shoulders as his unit approached the fateful crossroads. His letters home to his wife in Wisconsin revealed a man transformed by conflict. "I am no longer the same man who kissed you goodbye in Madison. War has aged me beyond my years, yet it has also shown me reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. Whatever comes in the days ahead, know that I fight not just for the Union, but for the hope of returning to your embrace." As June 30th dawned, the stage was set for one of the most significant battles in American history. Neither army fully understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. General George Gordon Meade, recently appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, established his headquarters and prepared his forces for what intelligence suggested would be a major engagement. His aide-de-camp later noted that Meade spent the evening poring over maps, muttering to himself about defensive positions and supply lines. The personal accounts of these men, preserved in yellowed letters and leather-bound diaries, would serve as windows into the souls of those who stood at this crucial crossroads of American destiny. Dawn broke gray and overcast on July 1st, 1863, as if nature herself sensed the impending carnage. Private Henry Fleming of the 3rd Wisconsin Infantry wrote in his diary, "I confess sleep eluded me last night. The sound of distant drums and the knowledge that today we meet the enemy in earnest fills me with a mixture of dread and anticipation that I cannot adequately express in words." The first shots rang out before 8 o'clock in the morning when Confederate forces under Major General Henry Heth encountered Union cavalry commanded by Brigadier General John Buford northwest of Gettysburg. Buford, recognizing the strategic importance of the high ground south of town, had positioned his men to delay the Confederate advance until infantry support could arrive. Corporal Samuel Davis of the 8th Illinois Cavalry was among Buford's men who faced that initial Confederate assault. In a letter later found in his personal effects, he described the chaos. "The rebels came at us like a gray wave breaking against the shore. Our carbines spoke with authority, but for every Confederate we dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. General Buford rode among us like a man possessed, shouting encouragement and rallying our spirits. I have never seen such determination in a single man." As word of the engagement spread, both armies began converging on Gettysburg with increasing urgency. Major General John Fulton Reynolds, commanding the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac, pushed his men hard toward the sound of the guns. Captain Edmund Rice of the 19th Massachusetts later recalled Reynolds's final words before a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet claimed his life. "The general turned to me and said, 'Tell General Meade we will hold this position at all costs.'" Those were among the last words he spoke before that fatal shot rang out. The death of Reynolds sent shockwaves through the Union ranks. Private Daniel Murphy of the 24th Michigan Infantry, part of the famous Iron Brigade, witnessed the general's fall. "When General Reynolds toppled from his horse, a pall seemed to settle over our entire line. Here was a man beloved by every soldier under his command, struck down in the opening minutes of what promised to be our greatest test. Yet rather than breaking our spirit, his sacrifice seemed to steel our resolve." On the Confederate side, the early success created its own momentum. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle, a British observer attached to General Lee's staff, noted in his journal, "The Confederate forces advanced with tremendous spirit, driving the Federal cavalry back through the streets of Gettysburg. The sight of gray uniforms sweeping through this Pennsylvania town filled the Southern soldiers with evident pride. They seemed to believe that they were bringing the war to Northern soil as a form of divine retribution. However, as more Union troops arrived, the tide began to turn." Brigadier General Alexander Webb of the Philadelphia Brigade described the crucial afternoon engagement. "Our boys fought with the fury of cornered wolves. House to house, street to street, we contested every inch of ground. The civilians who remained had barricaded themselves in their cellars while the battle raged over their heads. I saw one elderly woman, her white hair flowing, standing defiantly on her porch despite the bullets whistling past. By midday, Confederate forces under Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell had arrived from the north, threatening to envelop the Union position. The pressure on the Federal lines became almost unbearable. Sergeant William Scott of the 156th New York Infantry wrote to his brother, "We were pressed from 3 sides, our ammunition running low, and still the order came to hold the line. I looked into the faces of my comrades and saw the same grim determination that I felt in my own heart. We would not yield another inch of Pennsylvania soil to the rebels." As evening approached, Union forces found themselves driven back through the town to the high ground of Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, positions that would prove crucial in the days to come. Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, exhausted but defiant, penned these words in his diary. "Today we tasted defeat, but only in the tactical sense. Strategically, we hold the high ground, and our boys are angry. Tomorrow, the Confederates will learn the price of pursuing a cornered army." The 2nd day of July 1863 dawned clear and hot, with a humidity that seemed to press down upon the thousands of men arrayed across the Pennsylvania countryside. Colonel Strong Vincent of the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry rose before sunrise to inspect his brigade's positions along Cemetery Ridge. In a letter to his wife that he would never finish, he wrote, "The morning mist clings to the valley, between our positions and those of the enemy like the very breath of ghosts. I can see their campfires twinkling in the distance, thousands of them, like earthbound stars in a Confederate constellation." General Robert Edward Lee stood on Seminary Ridge, studying the Union positions through his field glasses. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, later recorded Lee's words that morning. "The enemy occupies a strong position, but we have concentrated our forces and must attack before they can be reinforced further. I fear this day will test the mettle of every man in this army. Lee's usually stoic demeanor showed signs of the enormous pressure he felt to deliver a decisive victory on Northern soil. Across the field, General George Gordon Meade had arrived during the night to take personal command of the Army of the Potomac. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the 2nd Corps, found Meade examining maps by candlelight in the early morning hours. Hancock later wrote to his wife, "General Meade appears aged beyond his years by the responsibility thrust upon him, yet his eyes burn with a fierce intelligence, and his methodical preparation of our defenses inspires confidence in every man who serves under him." Lieutenant Frank Haskell of Gibbon's staff provided one of the most detailed accounts of the Union preparations. The morning was spent strengthening our positions, placing artillery, and ensuring adequate supplies of ammunition reached every regiment. The men worked with quiet efficiency, understanding instinctively that their lives depended upon the thoroughness of these preparations. I observed soldiers writing what they believed might be their final letters home, sealing them carefully, and entrusting them to comrades. In the Confederate camps, the atmosphere was markedly different. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Old Pete to his men, harbored serious doubts about Lee's planned assault on the Union left flank. In correspondence discovered after the war, Longstreet confided to a friend, "I have argued strenuously with General Lee against this attack. The enemy holds a strong defensive position, and I fear we are about to dash ourselves against rocks that will not yield. Yet Lee's mind is made up, and loyalty demands that I execute his orders to the best of my ability." Private William Benjamin of the 15th Alabama Infantry, under Colonel William Calvin Oates, wrote in his diary, "We have been ordered to find and turn the Union left flank. The boys are in good spirits despite the hard marching of recent days. There is talk that one more victory might end this war, and every man hopes it will be so. I think of home, and wonder if I will ever again see the cotton fields of Alabama." Meanwhile, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was preparing the 20th Maine Infantry for what would become their most famous engagement. His brother Thomas, serving as a lieutenant in the same regiment, later recorded Joshua's address to the men. "The colonel told us that we were the extreme left of the entire Union line, that there were no troops beyond us to protect our flank. We must hold this position at all costs," he said, "for if we fail, the entire army may be lost." His words were spoken quietly, without dramatics, but every man understood their import. The heat was becoming oppressive by mid-morning, and water was growing scarce on both sides. Corporal James Williamson of the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry noted, "The sun beats down mercilessly, and the wool uniforms that served us well through winter now feel like portable ovens. Men are already beginning to show signs of heat exhaustion, and the battle has not yet begun in earnest. I fear what the afternoon will bring." Artillery exchanges had been sporadic throughout the morning, each side probing for weaknesses in the other's position. Captain John Bigelow of the 9th Massachusetts Battery wrote to his father, "The Confederate artillery speaks with growing confidence, their shells falling closer to our positions with each salvo. Our own guns respond in kind, and the thunder of cannon fire rolls across the countryside like an approaching storm. The civilian population has long since fled or taken shelter, leaving only the two armies to contest possession of this blood-soaked ground." As noon approached, the pieces were falling into place for what would become one of the most savage days of fighting in the entire war. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly as Confederate forces began their assault on the Union left flank. Colonel William Calvin Oates of the 15th Alabama Infantry led his men up the rocky slopes of Little Round Top, unaware that their attack would etch their names into the annals of military history. In his post-war memoir, Oates wrote, "The heat was nearly unbearable as we climbed those rocky slopes. My men were exhausted from the long march around the Union flank, but their spirits remained high. We expected to find the hill lightly defended and sweep down upon the enemy's rear." At the summit, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Infantry had just arrived after a forced march from their previous position. Private Theodore Garish of the 20th Maine later described the scene. "We reached the crest of the hill just as the Confederate forces began their assault. Below us, The gray line advanced with admirable precision, their battle flags snapping in the breeze. Colonel Chamberlain quickly deployed us into a long defensive line, our backs to the steep northern slope of the hill. The first clash came with shocking violence. Sergeant Elisha Cohen of the 20th Maine wrote in his diary, "The rebels struck our line like a thunderbolt. The crack of muskets became a continuous roar, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the shouted commands of officers. The air grew thick with smoke, and the metallic taste of gunpowder filled our mouths. I saw brave men on both sides fall within yards of each other, their blood mingling on the rocky ground. As the battle raged, ammunition began to run dangerously low in the Union ranks." Lieutenant Holman Melcher of the 20th Maine later recorded, "Word passed down the line that our cartridge boxes were nearly empty. Men began searching the pockets of fallen comrades for additional rounds. The situation was becoming desperate, and still the Confederates pressed their attack with undiminished fury." On the Confederate side, the 15th Alabama was suffering heavy casualties but continued to advance. Private William Jordan wrote to his sister, "We charged that hill 3 times, each assault bringing us closer to victory. The Yankees fought like demons, giving ground grudgingly and making us pay for every yard in blood. I saw Colonel Oates rally the men repeatedly, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he urged us forward." As the crisis reached its peak, Chamberlain made the decision that would define his legacy. Captain Ellis Spear of the 20th Maine described the moment. "The colonel saw that we could not hold much longer. Our line was thin, our ammunition nearly exhausted, and the enemy preparing for another assault. Then Chamberlain gave the order that seemed to come from desperation itself. 'Fix bayonets. We'll charge.' The bayonet charge of the 20th Maine became one of the most celebrated moments of the Civil War. Private Garish wrote, "Down the hill we went, screaming like banshees, our bayonets gleaming in the afternoon sun." The surprised Confederates, expecting to face a defensive line, suddenly found themselves confronted by a wall of steel and fury descending upon them. Many broke and ran, while others stood their ground and died like heroes. Colonel Oates, seeing his line crumbling, ordered a retreat. In his memoir, he reflected, "The sudden appearance of Federal reinforcements on our flank, combined with the unexpected bayonet charge, made our position untenable. I ordered the retreat, though it pained me to leave so many brave Alabamians on that rocky slope. We had come within an ace of victory, only to have it snatched away at the last moment." The human cost of the fight for Little Round Top was staggering. Surgeon Jonathan Letterman, Chief Medical Officer of the Army of the Potomac, recorded in his journal, "The casualties brought down from Little Round Top defied description. Men shot through the body, arms shattered by musket balls, faces blackened by powder burns. Yet in their eyes, I saw not defeat but a fierce pride in having held their ground against overwhelming odds." As evening approached, Little Round Top remained in Union hands, its slopes littered with the dead and wounded from both armies. Private George Buck of the 20th Maine wrote home, "We held the hill, but at such a cost. Good men lie still upon these rocks, their sacrifice ensuring that the Union line did not break. I pray that their death serve some greater purpose in this terrible conflict." The battle for Little Round Top had proven that ordinary men, when tested to their limits, could perform extraordinary acts of courage and determination. The 3rd day of July 1863 dawned with an oppressive silence that seemed to mock the carnage of the previous 2 days. Private Lewis Armistead Powell of the 53rd Virginia Infantry wrote in his final letter home, "The morning air carries the stench of death and the moans of the wounded. We know that today General Lee will ask everything of us, and we shall not fail him, though it cost us our lives." General Robert Edward Lee had decided upon a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Major General George Edward Pickett, whose division would spearhead the attack, met with Lee that morning. Captain Robert Bright of Pickett's staff later recorded their conversation. General Pickett, resplendent in his perfectly groomed uniform, his golden curls catching the morning light, assured General Lee that his Virginians would carry the enemy position or die in the attempt. There was something almost theatrical about Pickett's confidence, as if he were playing a role in some grand drama. The preliminary artillery bombardment began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the largest cannonade ever seen on the North American continent. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, Longstreet's chief of artillery, fired the signal gun that unleashed 150 Confederate cannons. In his memoir, Alexander wrote, "The sound was indescribable, like the very earth splitting apart. Our guns spoke with one voice, hurling death across the valley toward the Union positions. The air became thick with smoke, and the ground shook beneath our feet." On Cemetery Ridge, the Union defenders endured this hellish barrage with grim determination. Captain John Gibbon of the Philadelphia Brigade wrote, "For nearly 2 hours, the Confederate shells screamed over our heads or exploded among our ranks. Men pressed themselves against the earth, seeking any shelter from the iron hail. I saw veteran soldiers, men who had faced death 100 times, reduced to trembling wrecks by the intensity of the bombardment." Brigadier General Lewis Addison, Armistead, uncle of the private who shared his surname, prepared his brigade for the assault. At 56 years old, Armistead was among the oldest officers who would participate in the charge. His orderly later recalled, "The general walked among his men, speaking quietly to officers and enlisted men alike. He carried his black hat on the point of his sword, a gesture that would mark him as a target for every Union marksman, but served to inspire his Virginians to almost superhuman courage." When the artillery barrage lifted, 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge and began their advance across the mile-wide valley. Sergeant Randolph Shotwell of the 8th Virginia Infantry later described the scene. "We advanced in perfect order, our battle flags streaming in the breeze, the sun glinting off thousands of bayonets. For a moment, it seemed as if we were on parade rather than marching to almost certain death. The sight must have been magnificent to both friend and foe." Lieutenant Frank Haskell, observing from the Union lines, provided one of the most detailed accounts of the charge. "Never before had I witnessed such a display of military pageantry combined with such terrible purpose. The Confederate line stretched as far as the eye could see, advancing with parade ground precision across that deadly field. It was simultaneously beautiful and horrible, a testament to the courage of men willing to die for their beliefs." As the Confederate line approached the Union position, Federal artillery opened fire with devastating effect. Canister and grape shot tore great holes in the advancing ranks, but still they came on. Private John Dooley of the 1st Virginia Infantry wrote, "Men fell like wheat before the scythe, but we closed ranks and pressed forward. The ground became slippery with blood, and the air filled with the screams of wounded horses and men. Yet, our battle cry continued to ring out across that field of death." General Armistead, still carrying his hat on his sword point, led his men to within yards of the Union line before falling mortally wounded. His last words, recorded by a Union soldier who tended him, were, "Tell General Hancock that Lewis Armistead sends his regrets." Hancock, commanding the Union defense, had been Armistead's close friend before the war, and the tragedy of their meeting on opposite sides of this conflict epitomized the deeper tragedy of the Civil War itself. The charge ultimately failed, with catastrophic losses to the Confederate forces. Of the 15,000 men who began the advance, fewer than half returned to Seminary Ridge. General Lee wrote among the survivors, taking full responsibility for the disaster. Colonel Fremantle recorded Lee's words, "It is all my fault. I asked too much of you. We must now look to our defenses and prepare to meet the enemy's counterattack." Private James Clay of the 18th Virginia Infantry, one of the few survivors of Armistead's brigade, wrote in his diary, "We reached the stone wall and even broke through at one point, our battle flags flying over Union guns. But we were too few, too far from support, and the Yankees rallied with desperate courage. I saw the flower of Virginia's manhood lying broken on that field, their sacrifice offered up to the gods of war." The morning of July 4th, 1863, dawned gray and drizzly, as if the heavens themselves wept for the carnage wrought over the previous 3 days. Surgeon Jonathan Letterman moved among the wounded in the makeshift hospital established behind Union lines, his hands and apron stained crimson from his ceaseless efforts to save lives. In his journal he penned, Independence Day finds us not celebrating but counting our dead. The cost of preserving the Union has been written in blood across these Pennsylvania fields. I have operated for 3 days without rest, yet still the wounded cry out for relief that I cannot provide. General Robert Edward Lee began his retreat toward Virginia under cover of darkness and rain. His army, once invincible in the eyes of both North and South, limped southward carrying their wounded, in wagons that stretched for miles. Colonel Charles Marshall of Lee's staff later wrote, "The general bore the defeat with characteristic dignity, though I observed that he had aged years in the span of these 3 terrible days. He spoke little during the retreat, save to ensure that our wounded were cared for as circumstances permitted." Recent research published in the Gettysburg magazine, based on newly discovered personal papers, has revealed previously unknown details about the immediate aftermath of the battle and its psychological impact on participants. On the Union side, victory brought little immediate celebration. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain walked among his decimated regiment, noting how few familiar faces remained. In a letter to his wife Fanny, he reflected, "We have held the field and saved the Union, yet I feel no elation, only an overwhelming sadness for the good men who will never again see home." The 20th Maine entered this battle with 386 officers and men. We emerged with barely 200 capable of duty. The civilian population of Gettysburg found themselves inheriting a nightmare. Sarah Broadhead wrote, in her diary, "Our little town has become one vast hospital and graveyard. Every barn, church, and public building houses the wounded from both armies. The stench of death permeates everything, and the cries of the suffering echo through our streets day and night. We do what we can to help, but the scope of misery defies comprehension." Among the Confederate wounded left behind was Private William Benjamin of the 15th Alabama, whose final diary entry read, "I lie here in this Union hospital, tended by the same Yankees I tried to kill 3 days past. The irony is not lost on me. They treat me with kindness, sharing their meager rations and offering words of comfort. Perhaps when this war ends, if I live to see it, we might remember this humanity amidst all the hatred." General George Gordon Meade, the victor of Gettysburg, found himself criticized for allowing Lee's army to escape. In private correspondence with his wife, he revealed his exhaustion and frustration. "They say I should have pursued Lee immediately, but they did not see the condition of our army. We had fought 3 days against a determined enemy and paid a fearful price for victory. My men needed time to reorganize, to tend their wounded, to bury their dead with dignity." The impact of Gettysburg extended far beyond the immediate participants. President Abraham Lincoln, visiting the battlefield 4 months later to dedicate a national cemetery, would deliver his immortal address honoring the fallen. His brief remarks, lasting barely 2 minutes, would transform the meaning of the battle from a tactical victory into a moral crusade for national renewal. Lieutenant William Thompson of the 1st Minnesota Infantry, gravely wounded on July 2nd, dictated his final letter to a nurse. "Tell my sister Elizabeth that I have done my duty as I saw it. We came to preserve the Union and have achieved that goal, though the cost exceeds what any of us imagined. May future generations understand the price paid here and resolve never again to let brother fight against brother." The veterans of Gettysburg would carry their memories of those 3 days for the rest of their lives. Reunions held decades later would bring together former enemies who had tried to kill each other on these fields. Private John Dooley of the 1st Virginia Infantry, who survived Pickett's charge, would later write, "Time has softened the bitterness and left only respect for brave men who fought for their convictions. We were all Americans then, Americans still, and Americans forever." Colonel Strong Vincent of the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry, mortally wounded during the fighting for Little Round Top, used his final moments to write in his journal, "I die content, knowing that our cause shall prevail. The Union shall be preserved, and the principle that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall endure. Let this be my epitaph. He died so that his country might live." The Battle of Gettysburg had ended, but its echoes would reverberate through American history for generations to come. In the words and memories of those who fought there, we find not just the story of a military engagement, but the testament of a nation reborn through fire and blood, emerging from its darkest hour with a renewed commitment to the principles of freedom and union that define the American experience.